Hey guys, it's Steph from Render Me This. We are going to talk today about removing seam allowance. So in 3D, we actually do not stitch with seam allowance. If you have come across a pattern that looks like one of mine on my screen where there is red internal lines all around the entire perimeter of your garment, that probably means you have imported a pattern with seam allowance. Now, seam allowance is not super fun to remove, but I do have 3 different methods for you on how you can remove seam allowance. Typically, if one is not working for you, then you can use the other one to do it. So let's start with method 1 of our extract tool. Now, the extract tool, in my opinion, is going to be one of the easiest tools to use when removing seam allowance. There's a little bit more work when it comes to cleaning up the pattern afterwards, but I'll just show you. So under the Insert tool, I can click the drop down and I'm going to select one that says Extract. When I am there, I can see when I'm hovering over my garment, it's allowing me to extract the pattern that is on the inside of the red internal lines. So the outer edge would be the seam allowance that I want to remove. So I am just going to double click and I have now extracted the pattern. So not only am I able to now get my pattern that no longer has seam allowance, but you can see that my notches have actually carried over through this method. And then also I'm still keeping my original pattern with seam allowance. So you can see that that is one super easy method. This is only going to work though if your red internal line is a full shape. If your internal line is broken and you just have lines, that will not work for you. Now, if you have come across a red internal line that is broken and is not a shape, you can try method 2. Method 2 is going to be the built-in seam allowance function. If I select a pattern edge from my garment, such as this one right here, see that these red internal lines are broken. These are just guidelines. It's not one shape for me. I can select that edge, and on the right hand side under Actions, there's a button that says Seam Allowance. When I click that button, I can see underneath I get a slider, and it's allowing me to add or remove seam allowance. I'm going to do a -1/4 inch, and clicking Enter, I can see it now has adjusted that pattern to that 1/4 inch of where that seam allowance should go. If I want to do it a little bit quicker, it looks like this pattern itself is a 1/4 inch all the way around. I'm going to hold down the Shift key on my computer, select all of the edges that I may need, and on the right hand side, click Seam Allowance and do a -0.25. I'm going to click Enter, and I can see I have removed that seam allowance. The final part of this is I am going to click this check mark, and it's going to say the cut lines are protected due to negative seam allowance. Are you sure you want to switch to sew lines? I am going to say OK, and I now have my pattern. I can remove these red lines as I do not need these guides anymore. A quick way to remove all these red lines is locking your piece right up here, marquee selecting all of those red lines left, and hitting delete. Unlocking that piece, and I now have my pattern. Now, a nice part about doing your seam allowance this way is up on the right hand side there is this button that hides and shows the allowance. So I can actually see where that allowance previously was on all of the patterns I've done that to. You are not able to see that with method 1, but only with method 2 are you allowed to use that hide and show allowance button. Now the third method is going to be converting your internal line to an actual pattern. So this method again is only going to work if your internal line is all connected into one shape. To do that, I select the red internal line, and on the right hand side under Actions, it's going to say Convert Internal Line to, and when I click that drop down, I can do Shape, and it has now moved that red internal line to a new shape. So I do lose the original red lines on that pattern. So if you're no longer needing this, I would suggest selecting it and deleting it so that you don't get your patterns mixed up. But that is your third method of removing seam allowance. Each of them have their benefits, each of them have their disadvantages. You can see in this third and final method, it's created a ton of corner points for me. That's not super great for me to have to go back and clean those up. So this method is probably my least favorite out of the three. I do like the second one a lot. It just is a little bit more tedious. I will say the first one is probably going to be your quickest method if you have that fully created shape of your internal lines. If you have any questions about seam allowance, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, I hope you learned something and stay tuned for the next episode.